This lecture looks at Romanticism, the movement which is directly opposed to the logic of Neoclassicism in Britain, specifically during the late Georgian period. Now, Britain, specifically Georgian Britain, was one of the wealthiest nations in the world at the time because of the Industrial Revolution, because they were the first to industrialize and have a large middle class because of it. Now, Parliament in London did not support history painters, and so we find a different type of art and different genres developing in England than in France or elsewhere. Since 1688, importantly, the king had shared power with Parliament. Actually, the Prime Minister is the most powerful person politically in Britain. Here we find these political cartoons with Pitt, the Prime Minister, writing George III as they battle seditious writings, showing, of course, that the Prime Minister is directing political policy and wielding its might, and not the actual king. The same thing is true as we move into the 20th and 21st century, as the Queen is merely a figurehead, whereas the Prime Minister is responsible for the daily activities politically and directing the country. Nobles during this time would decorate their homes with old masters' paintings, so they're really only interested in artists from the Renaissance primarily. Contemporary painters like Thomas Gainsborough, as mentioned, would be hired for portraits of these noble families, but not to make history paintings. There were no church commissions in England, as the Anglican Church was diametrically opposed to the strategies of the Catholic Church. Henry VIII, in fact, destroyed religious art in these churches to differentiate his church from others. Puritans and the Anglican Church did not commission works of religious art, thus history painting did not find the same type of prestige as in France or Italy or Spain. Profit, on the other hand, came from other avenues for artists, such as Hogarth making prints, or small works for the middle class or private collectors. Here we have, thanks to Edmund Burke, a new version of Romanticism that has these modern traits in literature that are going to be very different from Neoclassicism, again valuing imagination over reason. And it is going to be in his essay, The Origins of Our Ideas of the Sublime, from 1757, that Edmund Burke is going to define an idea that is very important for understanding the English style of Romanticism and movement. And that is the sublime, as he describes it being a mixture of awe and terror, much like the effect one would get by witnessing a shipwreck, or a forest fire, or being on the opposite shore as a building burns, right? Which is going to have this mixture that we see of an act of nature that has the ability to destroy an immense amount of objects and threaten our lives, terrifying us, but we can appreciate it. We are exhilarated by it because we are at a safe distance from it, much like appreciating a Gothic horror novel or watching a scary movie today. And this is going to relate the type of communication and argumentation that you're familiar with in the three varieties. That being, you can argue by way of logos, ethos, or pathos. That being, you can argue by way of logic, a logical argument that by neoclassical standards would be ideal, like an exemplum virtutis. You can argue by ethos, which is by credibility, that one is of course going to be credentialed and or you should listen to them because of what they are, what they have done. Or finally, you have the argument that is much more appropriate for Romanticism, and that is pathos. That being, we're going to be arguing by way of emotion, that emotional argument that draws on our heartstrings and something that is going to be related to, say, romantic love or terror. As the most powerful of human emotions was to evoke by fear and pain, we find this idea of the sublime very powerful and alluring in England. We find that the sublime is described as being experienced from a safe distance and would be thrilling because of it, like watching a raging fire. Thus, we have this description of the sublime as delightful horror, which was quite distinct from beauty, since it is defined as love or some passion similar to it. It is related to the renewed interest in the Middle Ages that we see at this time at the end of the 18th century, a reaction against modernization, industrialization, and the move against one's own history. Thus, sublimity and turmoil are the symptoms of this reaction, as the medieval culture is seen to be in peril here. So culturally, England finds itself rooted in Northern Europe instead of going through the Renaissance, as did Italy and other areas. So they distinguish themselves from these other countries. Thus, there was a renewed interest in the Middle Ages that we see in architecture as well as in art. Here, Horace Walpole, the son of the first Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole, is going to be one of the major exponents for medieval designs. He would purchase a home and then rename it Strawberry Hill, transforming it into a medieval fantasy that was self-designed to recall this earlier era before classical design. Here on Strawberry Hill, we have a number of different elements that would be considered medieval or from the Middle Ages. He adds turrets, battlements, and medieval-style windows that strive instead of symmetry for asymmetry, whereas classical architecture, seen in the Renaissance in church and domestic architecture alike, is going to value geometric design and balance. We find that they see the medieval style of architecture and medieval design as one that is going to be devoid of balance. The plan itself, one can see, cannot be struck down the middle on a bilateral axis and or to be bilaterally symmetrical. In fact, it aims at asymmetry. Here we can see the different types of Gothic spires and churches, as well as crenulated towers, and these battlements are going to be brought together in a domestic setting. The interior, with its fan vaulting, also harkens back to Renaissance and medieval-style architecture in churches, as the walls fan out into the ceiling. The stucco ceilings are actually in the late Gothic Perpendicular style from England, and copy existing monuments in England. Specifically, Gloucester Cathedral and its choir, decorated in this perpendicular style popular until 1550. It is uniquely English, with this rectilinear system of vast walls and windows, with a repetition of cusp panels that are framed in huge grids of vertical lines. It metamorphoses into these fan vaults in the ceiling, sweeping circular ridge ribs which appear as giant fans opening up above. If we compare this to the type of interior decoration preferred during the neoclassical period, we can see now a reaction against it, whereby instead of geometric ornamentation and a minimalist aesthetic, we have one that celebrates the excesses of decoration common in the Gothic era. They are opposites, but what is interesting is they coexist in Britain. We have at the same time an interest in the style that is considered neoclassical and this new romantic style that harkens back to the Middle Ages. They both reveal this desire to live in the past, just different pasts. One in classical antiquity and the other one in the Middle Ages. Similarly, we find William Beckford purchasing a monastery and converting it to a dwelling that he renames Fonthill Abbey. In this love of what is medieval, we have, in fact, a horrible failure as it becomes an uninhabitable domicile. But this Gothic fantasy would epitomize the sublime of looking to this other way of thinking, of something that is, of course, horrifying and, of course, beautiful simultaneously. Here we can find the idea of living inside of an old monastery or church to be directly in line with this new romantic sensibility. It is redecorated here at Fonthill Abbey in the perpendicular style that, of course, we also see in Strawberry Hill, one that the patrons believe harkens back to something that is more purely medieval, Christian, and British. Therefore, there is a new role in art in Britain that is neither to please nor to moralize for the spectator, but instead is intended to release a flood of emotions in the viewer, and that is quintessentially romantic. It is based on classical history quite often, but we also find medieval sources and those based on Elizabethan poetry. Now, turning to Benjamin West, we have a different understanding of neoclassical history painting, in which we have an American-born artist that studies in Philadelphia and then in Rome. In Rome, he meets Winkelmann, right, the founder of art history and archaeology, who writes the history of ancient art and describes what we know as the characteristics of neoclassicism. There he becomes a student of Mainz, a very close friend of Winkelmann, until finally settling in London in 1763. Now, one of the founding members of the Academy, alongside Kaufmann and Reynolds, West is going to be known for certainly the grand manner that Benjamin West and that Joshua Reynolds is going to be known for, but he also introduces something new. Here we find West with his Cave of Despair, illustrating a not neoclassical subject, but instead an Elizabethan one, for this is an Elizabethan poet, Edmund Spenser, and illustrating the Fairy Queen, which was an epic poem. In this particular episode, the Red Cross Knight enters a cave of despair, represented by this old man, and is about to commit suicide as he holds the dagger to his throat, pulling away his armor. It is a medieval subject, given the armor and the interior, but we find the classical aspects of the corpse, the skeleton, the ghost, and the mourners are going to bring together the same interest that we saw in his Agrippina landing at Brunzinium with the ashes of Germanicus. Here we have this notion of confusion and frenzy versus the classical approach he showed with Agrippina, of this orderly procession from right to left. Thus we can see him working in both the romantic sensibility and the classical, showing there are two different audiences that prefer different things at this time in Britain. Here we find this notion of dread and anxiety, illustrating the sublime. The moral lesson here with the Cave of Despair is that the knight, representing man's struggle for righteousness, along with the old man who succumbs to despair, is going to be helped by Una, representing truth or religion that saves man from this type of despair. The subject, of course, is not from classical antiquity and does not show a classical moral. But it does, of course, appeal to this new audience that appreciates the sublime. In his Death on a Pale Horse, we have a different type of painting that is very popular at the time and is designed for the masses. A huge painting at 14 feet tall and 25 foot wide. We have here the last 10 years of his life dedicated to a series of colossal works like this one. And they are both sublime in terms of subject matter and scale. In this example, we have an episode from St. John's Book of Revelation, where we have the four horsemen of the apocalypse taking over the world and slaughtering everyone. Quote, "Behold a pale horse, and his name that sat upon him was Death, and hell followed with him. And power was given unto them over the fourth part of the earth, to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth." The subject matter had been part of mass appeal for centuries. As of course noted in earlier classes, the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse series by Albrecht Dürer also capitalizes on this millennial anxiety and the end of the world. The idea of having this type of painting that was the equivalent of a cinematic experience showcasing the end of the world is not new, and certainly has not gone away. We still have the greatest box office record holders being related to and showcasing these types of apocalyptic events. So they appeal to the greatest a number of people and the sensibility of the impending doom of the end of the world scenario.
Here we find the composition reinforcing this dramatic subject of the end of the world as the four horsemen trample and kill at will. Here we find, as we move through the work from left to right, these figures being trampled much like a Baroque composition, say with Rubens in his animal hunts, which of course inspired Benjamin West. We see the figures moving in and out of space foreshortened against the picture plane as they are trampled, moving ever dramatically forward off to the right. Here, what is interesting with the Death on the Pale Horse is it's not commissioned. Instead, we find that they're going to charge an entrance fee in the public area, the Pall Mall, a very important crossroads for the public in the center of the city. Thus, this is a new strategy for artists to make money off of their work. They do not sell very large history paintings or portraits, but instead charge a nominal fee as you would at the box office to see a movie. So this new strategy is one of those that comes out of the unique situation in England, whereby the same economic opportunities and patronage are not afforded their artists as in France and Italy. Turning now to Henry Fuseli, we have a Swiss-born artist here who was a Protestant minister, very interested in theology, philosophy, and literature. We know that Joshua Reynolds will convince him to become a painter and will become one of the best known in all of Britain. He would spend 8 years in Italy, and while there, be a great example of what the anxiety of influence is, that being looking at antiquity and the awe-inspiring grandeur of it, and of course not knowing if you can live up to the same type of creative potential. Thus you have this type of creative impotence in the face of such greatness in the past.
We see that in the massive leftover remnants of antiquity scattered throughout Rome, from the leftover shells of amphitheaters and of baths, right, to the massive statues of the portrait of Constantine. It is amazing, these artists coming to Rome at the time. They marvel at the size and the scale of these works of art and wonder how they would possibly be able to match them.
After Fuseli settles in London, he will establish his reputation with works like The Nightmare here, exhibited at the Royal Academy. So popular was this work that he made multiple versions of it.
We see that in the works of Henry Fuseli, an artist that moves to England and becomes famous for these very Shakespearean and Freudian works like The Nightmare of 1781, illustrating the figure, this Mara, this creature that causes nightmares, sitting on the chest of this woman dressed in white, thus indicating that she is a virgin. She, of course, is going to be flailing off of this bed, showing us the horrifying images that this male libido or incubus is going to be visiting on her in this hour of the night. You find that this, in the background, we have a horse that's going to be poking its head through these red curtains, thus suggesting in a Freudian way sexual intercourse as a phallic object entering the vulva. So you find that the dreaming and sexuality and these themes brought to the fore here were not exactly explicitly stated at the time, but would be pointed to by Sigmund Freud himself as an excellent example of the power of dreams to reveal our fears. And in this case, the fear of a female virgin, of what is going to come with the male libido in her life. So what we have here with the imagery that would be taken from Elizabethan poetry and Shakespearean Gothic imagery is this Gothic thrill combined with this sublime terror, this notion that we are safe from this given that it is a nightmare. It is not real, but it still can horrify us. It can terrify us. Thus, we understand that nightmares are going to be a great example of the sublime. Now, the Shakespearean paintings that are going to be made by Fuseli, such as those for the Midsummer Night's Dream, are going to relate this dreamscape that is appreciated, especially in England, being popularized by Shakespeare and Shakespearean plays. Right? We do not see the same interest in dreamscapes in other countries.
As with the nightmare, we here have, in Titania and Bottom, an example of this type of Shakespearean interest in fairies, leading to a new genre of painting in Britain known as fairy painting. So here, the subject is A Midsummer Night's Dream, where Oberon, the king of the fairies, quarrels with his wife Titania. And we find that he has a spell cast on him while asleep in order to make her fall in love with the first person she sees, which happens to be a man in a donkey mask. Here we find at the bottom this amateur actor wearing this donkey mask. We have the entire menagerie of fairies who are amused. A scholar is on a leash in the foreground with this very alluring fairy, whereas you have a miniature muscle man in the lower right-hand corner and all manner of creatures in between. Thus, this single-handedly spawns this British genre known as fairy painting, this uniquely English genre that would only exist because of Shakespeare. The fantastical inventions and the fancifulness was quite appreciated at the time because it's a visual manifestation or an example of Shakespearean turns of phrase and inventiveness in prose. In addition to the interest in fairy painting, we find that Fuseli also is going to be interested in the sublime. Now, subjects of the sublime, as described at the time, could be including starry nights, thundering waterfalls, storms, roaring animals, fires, acts of God, destructive forces. But it also can be seen to describe the appearance of Satan in Paradise Lost in 1667 by John Milton. Here we find that Satan and death separated by sin is an example of one of these paintings that attempts to capitalize on the sublime, bringing in this British poet and description of Satan. Here we have a small copy of a colossal painting that, like Death on a Pale Horse, would have been exhibited at the Pall Mall, like Benjamin West's work. Thus we find that themes from Paradise Lost are also very popular at this time. Here we find that Burke would single out Satan from Milton as this literary sublime figure, as being very beautiful, and describes him as youthful with curly locks and large eyes. Here we find that Sin in the center is a half-woman, half-snake creature that is going to be seen as this allegorical personification in this way, as separating Satan from death. Now we know that Fuseli makes illustrations for his friend Lavater, especially for his essays on physiognomy, beginning in 1779, where they would have facial features illustrating different types of temperaments or personalities. Here, the physiognomy of Satan is going to be one that is captured and illustrated in these essays and included for the characteristic facial features with the large eyes and curly locks that are characteristic of the Prince of Darkness. This has a long tradition in the history of art, going back to the Aristotelian Physiognomica, which is a book that relates that humans are going to have animal traits, and we can tell what type of traits those are by diagnosing with this diagnostic criteria what features animals have. So if you're a great warrior, you will have a leonine physiognomy with a great mane around your head, this big curly lock of hair showing you're a great warrior. Or if you are going to be of low moral standing and are a thief, you might look like a weasel, for instance. So for instance, here with Satan, we have the choleric temperament, one that is shown to be angry with these curly haired lockets, wide open eyes, and a prominent eyebrow. Thus, we believe we can diagnose someone's personality by how they appear, by these various characteristics. Turning now to William Blake, we have one of the most idiosyncratic artists of the period. His unique style comes from the fact that he is going to make his own prints. As a poet, a painter, and a printmaker, he does not farm out his designs like Hogarth did to different engravers or etchers. Instead, he illustrated his own handmade books. So he has a very unique set of subject matter and style to illustrate them with. In his Songs of Innocence of 1789, followed by his Songs of Experience of 1794, we find that each page is meticulously illustrated by hand, with a poem on the same copper plate, all engraved together. This new etching technique, where you would write on the plate and then hand decorate it with watercolor, was unique to him, and he claimed that his dead brother appeared to him in a vision to teach him how to do this. And this says a lot about William Blake and his approach to art, and how ethereal and spiritual it was. Here, in a manner of nursery rhymes, with the lamb, a very popular one, we have this appeal to children, but the meditations are very adult, as they're going to relate themes of good and evil, things that are divine and demonic, though are going to be couched in very childlike terms. Here we have gently curving lines and soft pastel colors when it comes to the poem of the Lamb. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? On the other hand, with the tiger, we have an austere style with ominous colors. As we have here, the contrary states of the human soul, as he calls it, has opposing gentleness, humility, innocence to this type of brutality, pride, and experience. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night. So very popular poems that William Blake is going to not only develop, design, but also hand color. He was informed in his theology by Swedish scientist and mystic theologian Emanuel Swedenborg. Here he would maintain that all of creation had its origin in divine love, which was perfect. Whereas evil came into the world because man loved himself more than God. Thus selfishness is the ultimate sin that takes us away from the divine love of God. Swedenborgian philosophy and political beliefs are going to lead to a new type of style with Blake, as he sympathized with the French Revolution. He even joined a radical political circle with Fuseli and Mary Wollstonecraft, which combined mystical beliefs and radical politics. Hence we have this notion of the prophetic or Lambeth types of books that he develops. Lambeth referring to the suburbs where he lived in the 1790s. In these prophetic books, such as the Book of Los here, we have a very cryptic and obscure approach to the subject matter. And according to Blake, the meaning only becomes clear after long and careful study and contemplation. Here we have a man who prostrates himself before an altar in front of a large open book with a large sun obscured by these dark blotches. The sun, once again, does not give light, but instead is a festering celestial body, the sickening world in which men find themselves living in. Perhaps the most famous example by William Blake is The Great Red Dragon and the Woman Clothed in the Sun of 1806-9, one of his most popular watercolors, and is reproduced the most. This was commissioned for over 100 paintings as part of that, illustrating the Bible. Here we have the Book of Revelations, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew the third part of the heavens, the stars of the heavens, and did cast them out to the earth. In the example, we find many references in popular culture with the back of this anonymous dragon, just as the back of the anonymous man in Los. As we see here, the meaning is very cryptic. What specifically is he referring to? Nothing is laid out clearly as protagonist and antagonist, nor is there a clear resolution. But this mystical approach to religious subject matter appealed greatly to an audience in England and still resonates today. Of course, Blake did not only illustrate religious subjects, he also brought in contemporary ones, such as the spiritual form of Pitt guiding Behemoth from 1805. Here we have William Pitt the Younger, the British Prime Minister, shown in a long gown with a halo behind his head. We find that he holds the reins that controls the Old Testament behemoth, this great monster with the powers of war unleashed on the world by Pitt against the French, specifically Napoleon. Now, this is not cast in a classical guise, nor is it shown in a contemporary fashion, as in the examples here with David and Gros. So, for instance, we do not have an ancient battle of the Romans, nor do we have a contemporary scene of Napoleon. Instead, we find that he's going to be showcasing and classifying these contemporary events within his own mystical theology. He claimed that he was inspired for this by a vision of ancient paintings and sculptures on the walls, temples, towers, cities, and palaces erected in the highly cultivated states of Egypt, Moab, Edom, and Aram among the rivers of paradise. Thus, he's talking about visions of Old Testament cultures of the Bronze Age. He hoped, once again, that you'd be emulated in this way by applying this grandeur to a modern heroes on a small scale, in his words. So this is bringing together Old Testament subject matter with, of course, the notion of something apocalyptic, but showcasing a contemporary subject here. What we find with the contemporary heroes in classical garb is quite common at the time and not unique to Blake. For we often have other examples, such as that by James Barrie with the portrait of William Pitt, the same Prime Minister, whereby we have a Roman bust with an allegory of Britannia pointing to his accomplishments. So here are two different examples of showing the same thing, that being the significance of William Pitt and his accomplishments. But here we're showing a contemporary figure cast in a different way.
Here we have his Death of General Wolfe, right? That's going to be a fairly large painting, 4 feet by 7 feet, recording, seemingly in a history painting format, the death of a great general who dies in 1759 in the war with the French over Quebec, which obviously the British lost, given they still speak French today in Quebec. Now, the type that we see here actually does not derive from classical antiquity. Instead, you find that academics are going to be shocked because the figures are in contemporary attire. This is recording a contemporary scene, much like photojournalism we would understand today. If someone died in battle, that died for their country, and you find that they are not going to be in classical costume. It is more common in the neoclassical era for contemporary subjects to be presented in a classical vein, right? Reflecting the interest in, say, Julius Caesar, or the exploits of Germanicus, or the war between the Romans and Sabines, that cast as a metaphor for contemporary events. Now we see people shockingly in the dress of the time, right? But still using this grand manner technique so appreciated by Reynolds and what he lectured on in the Academy. For we have a new genre here invented that is very popular with the public and remains so today. That is known as modern history painting, in which we are using the techniques of traditional academic history painting, which take us through a scene, telling us what is the most significant and important elements, and convincing us of the importance of it, right? But doing so in a contemporary way, with figures we would recognize dressed as we would dress in these episodes that we would recognize. Now, this grand manner and these classical tropes you might recognize from other paintings, such as the Symbols in America, like Washington Crossing the Delaware by Emanuel Leutz, in which you find these figures are going to heroically hold one's head up, direct your attention to the most significant figures. The death of this general obviously is significant, for we find, even as they would call it, the noble savage or this Native American, recognizing the significance of the death of this Englishman while everyone gathers around, holding him to his last breath, wringing their hands together. All of which you should recognize from the Christian tradition. So we find that this does not reflect reality, because we know from reports from the field he dies at the base of a tree virtually alone. We do not have all of these figures gathering around him. They're going about fighting in the battle. And Native Americans fought on the side of the French in Quebec, not on the side of the British. So therefore we would not have a Native American stopping to look at the death of this Brit. They would, of course, be continuing to fight against them. The notion of having all of these figures surrounding and in a unified fashion lamenting the death of this individual is going to reflect the lamentation type from Christianity, whereby General Wolfe is going to be playing the role of Christ with his dutiful apostles and those that are there at his death, lamenting and crying over the fact that he has died as a martyr for the cause. So the significance of this scene is shown to us clearly in a way that we would be familiar with in the history of art. But it's a contemporary scene, and people really appreciated this and are going to flock to see it in especially the Pall Mall in a central area in London. Now, turning to the colonies, the English colonies in America, we have King George III, who's ruling at the time, imposing a series of taxes and not allowing the American colonies to have any representation or say over how the taxes were spent. Therefore, we get the rallying cry in the 13 colonies and the Declaration of Independence signed in 1776, being no taxation without representation. So these 13 colonies embraced the republicanism in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, vowing to throw off the yoke of tyranny. And they are going to then rise up against the English and declare their independence, with the help, we might add, of other countries in Europe that were at war with England at the same time, vying for control in these colonial enterprises, specifically France.
Next class, we will turn to what happens in France during the French Revolution and the revolutionary propaganda which attempted to bolster these activities, which were at times horrific and quite bloody.